I have already soft DNF'd 2 science fiction books that I was really looking forward to. Not because they were bad, but because my ADHD and focus issues are really fucking me up this month. So I think the solution might be short stuff and audiobooks. I'm Kindlin, also known as Feed the Writer. I'm an author, a screenwriter, and a game writer, but for the purposes of this channel, I am a reader. And this is my reading for January 2025. A thing you may not know about me is that I love the Muppets, which is why it should surprise nobody that my first successful full read of 2025 is Muppet Napoleon by Emily McGovern. This is a very short comic/zine in which the author and illustrator pitches a Muppet movie idea based on the life of Napoleon. During these short few pages, she outlines a very compelling argument about what makes a really great adaptive Muppet property and explores the concept of hubris and looking at history with clear and honest eyes, all of which she manages to tie together spectacularly well. And she does it all with such a perfect understanding of the Muppets' sense of humor and also of heart. And the sketches are wonderful. I could genuinely talk about the Muppets for so long. Like, if you ever see me at a party, just come up to me and start chatting about the Muppets and we'll have a really nice time. Jim Henson is one of my all-time creative heroes. Kermit the Frog is one of my all-time favorite people / frogs. And reading this really lovely tribute from the author of Bloodlust and Bonnets, which I also really enjoyed, just made me feel like I was starting off the year with a bit of a kindred spirit. It's also the sort of fan creation that made me remember what it was like to just write silly little things for fun, which as a professional writer, I don't really do a lot of anymore. But reading this made me remember and then seek out my own deranged Muppet fan project that I wrote years ago on the edge of an absolute hysterical breakdown, and which saved me from said hysterical breakdown. And that project was a movie version of Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds starring the Muppets. Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds is, I think, a 70s concept album that my parents really loved, and so I just heard a lot growing up. It is such a niche crossover that there could not possibly be an audience for it, and therefore it is the most fun I have ever had writing anything. Actually, no, my mum is the target audience, but even if you are not my mum and you would like to take a look at this unhinged creation, it is currently available on my website. It's not as good as this, but I really enjoyed reading it and giving it a bit of a tidy up to put online. I'm really glad I started the year this way. My second read of the month/year was a lot heavier than the first, and that book is The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World by Anthony Lowenstein. Anthony Lowenstein is an investigative journalist and filmmaker, as well as an author, and a great deal of his work has focused on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In this book, he does go into the origins and history of the occupation, but the main focus is on Israel's development of weapons, surveillance, and crowd control technologies, which are tested on Palestinian civilians and then sold to governments and regimes around the world as battle tested, and the very specific ways that Israel has used these industries to position itself as indispensable to many powerful nations. This book is horrific in many ways, and one of those ways is the insight it gives into geopolitics and international relations post-World War II. It has really helped me to understand not just the lack of condemnation from so many of our governments, as Israel has slaughtered tens, probably hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on live stream over the past 15 months and counting, but also the really disgusting shows of support for Israel. This book was difficult to read, not just because it was written not academically. The focus is obviously on Israel and its leading defense contractors and weapons and tech firms, but they have dealt in those weapons and tech to so many governments and regimes and coups and massacres that it is just so much information to take in. It is chock full of dates and names and countries and quotes. Like, it is relentless. I did start reading it on paper, but I had to switch to the audiobook because my brain really bounces off nonfiction that's written this way. But if I listen to it, for some reason, it just soaks in better. But it was still a lot to listen to. Like, I was cooking dinner and like hanging up my washing, just staring into the void. I have to be honest, I don't really know how to talk about this book. I do struggle to talk about non-fiction in general. I am quite new to reading it, and I don't really feel like my understanding of craft carries over to it. Unless we're talking about narrative non-fiction or essays or memoir, which this very much is not. There's also a very self-conscious part of my mind that tells me that I am not smart enough to be reading this, and certainly not smart enough to be talking about it, especially when it's about a topic that is this big, this relevant, this important, which is silly, but I do think it's how a lot of people probably feel talking about nonfiction when they're coming into it, and talking about Israel and Palestine. I don't know if people are still getting fired in my country for saying anything against Israel in a public forum, but I do know that artists are still very much losing funding and opportunities to exhibit their work if they support Palestine. So I do think it is worth it, even if I don't feel smart enough or eloquent enough to say something. I am tempted to talk about what I learned from this book, but so much of it was new to me, even though I have spent the past year and a bit trying to educate myself on the history of Israel's occupation of Palestine, that I don't even know where to start. And I do want to be clear that this is not an shadowy Jewish figures are secretly controlling the New World Order book. The Jewish people and Israel are not interchangeable words. The most virulent Zionists tend not to be Jewish people. Israel's strongest supporters frequently do not like Jewish people. While this book does situate Israel in a very key role in global violence and politics, it is very much in a way that draws the line back to capitalism, colonization, and white supremacy. But yeah, I don't know how to start talking about that here, because if I talk about any of it, I feel like I have to talk about all of it, and that's the whole book. I could try to talk about what I see as the themes or the central thesis of this book, but honestly, it overloaded me to the point where the only thesis I can think of is something like, this is the world you live in. It is not governed by values or ethics, but by money, power, violence, oppression, and propaganda. And all of these things flourish with our ignorance. This book is a very level-headed and well-sourced exploration of the ways in which our progressive governments and authoritarian regimes and corporations are linked, connected, complicit in the art of murder for profit. I can't say that I enjoyed reading this, but that's okay. I didn't expect to, and I don't just read for enjoyment. I wanted to learn more about this diabolical fucking industry that is weapons and tech and surveillance. And I wanted to understand more about why my Prime Minister, who used to attend and speak at pro-Palestinian rallies, is now so far up the arse of Benjamin Netanyahu that all you can see is his feet. And now I have some idea, and while there would never have been a good answer, it still isn't good enough. I can see why this rambling I'm doing at you might not make you want to run out and buy this book or ever read it, but I do recommend reading it if you think this isn't something that's gonna send you spiraling in a way you can't recover from, because the surveillance and crowd control chapters towards the end are particularly pertinent to, I think, where we're going in the next few years. I don't know why I said I think. These technologies are literally being sold to our governments. Our governments want and are very much already, in some cases, using these. Anyway, free Palestine and support BDS. Boycotts work, and if nothing else, they really piss off Benjamin Netanyahu. I read a really lovely short story in Uncanny Magazine, the online version. It's called 6 People to Revise You by J.R. Dawson. It's 4,500-ish words, I think, so a really short read. Somewhere between like 5 and 15 minutes, depending on your reading speed. I'm closer to the 15. It's spec-fic, it's set very near future, and it asks the question, what if you could completely re-engineer yourself, but only according to the surveys of 6 people who know you and your every flaw? The main character undergoing this process, or at least collecting the surveys to begin the process, is non-binary and not fully out, which adds an extra emotionally complex layer to it all. It's a really fascinating piece, and it's a really clever, wonderful way of conceptualizing the way that we give so much extra weight to criticism over compliments. I'll link it in the video description below, somewhere, wherever the fuck it lives. I really think it'll be a great use of a few minutes in your day. And broadly speaking, I just cannot recommend squeezing pieces of short fiction into your life enough. Everybody hold your applause, but I finished another audiobook. This one was James by Percival Everett, which is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain from the perspective of Jim, the runaway slave in the story. Huckleberry Finn is, of course, one of those like landmark American classic books. I have not read it. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty sure the only pre-1920s American classic I have ever actually read is Little Women. But thanks to living in a country that has been dominated by American culture and media for my entire life, I am aware of the shape of the story of Huckleberry Finn. I did briefly consider reading Huckleberry Finn first, just for some sense of context and to see how this book was in conversation with the other, but I held off for 2 main reasons. One is that I think all books that are adaptations or riffs on or in conversations with other books should still be able to stand completely on their own. And the other, which became very quickly evident when I started reading James, was that it is kind of deliciously subversive and also thematically appropriate to let James tell his side of the story first. So let's put Huck Finn aside for now and talk about James by Percival Everett. James begins in Missouri in 1861 and follows a slave named Jim, who is owned along with his wife and daughter by a local judge. The judge is seen as a good master, relatively speaking, and Jim and the other slaves seem to consider themselves in a crap but ultimately fairly manageable situation. The slaves have community with each other, James has taken on the secret education of the children, and he has found real pockets of happiness in this life with his wife and his daughter. So of course our story begins with Jim's wife overhearing that the judge's housekeeper is planning to sell him and only him, thus separating the family. Knowing that if he is sold, he will never see his wife and daughter again, Jim chooses to run away and buy himself time to figure out what the hell to do. This is already an incredibly dangerous thing for him to do, but he decides it is worth the risk. Until, of course, very shortly after he runs away, he is found by Huckleberry Finn, who is a young boy with a dead mother and an abusive father who has been taken in by the judge. He's heard that his dad is coming back to town, and he is so scared at seeing him again that he has faked his death and run off. Jim is fully aware of how this is going to look to everyone back at the judge's residence and every lawmaker in the area, so he is instantly aware that he is now not just a runaway slave, but a runaway slave who has murdered a little white boy. He begs Huck to go back and show everyone that he is in fact not dead. But Huck refuses, and so the only place to go from there is take the boy and escape to a northern state where Jim can be free and can go about perhaps making the money to buy his wife and daughter. Unfortunately, in this time, there is absolutely no easy way for a black man without an obvious owner and a little boy to get from the south to the north. So obstacles abound. And I can absolutely see how Huckleberry Finn's side of this story is called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because for him, this is great fun. But for Jim, this is the tensest fucking situation he has ever been in. Jim is a really interesting character with a really great narrative voice. The book is told in first-person perspective, I think past tense, so we are really right in his head during all of this. And there is a real dichotomy to Jim/James as he comes to be known toward the end of the book. There is the Jim as seen by and performed for white people, and there is James as he sees himself. Jim is a pleasing, submissive, affable simpleton because that is what he needs to be to survive. But James has, over the course of however many decades he's been alive, it's never made clear, but I assume he's in his early 30s, to use whatever time he can steal in the judge's library to teach himself to read. And not just read, but engage. You know, there are different levels of literacy based on understanding and critical engagement with the text, and James has gotten himself right the fuck up there. There are so many moments and motifs in this book that really seek to illustrate the hypocrisy of the white folks in the antebellum South and the absolute absurdity that they were in any way inherently superior to their black slaves, you know, just by virtue of their fucking skin color. Because the judge isn't reading these fucking books. Most of them have never been opened until James touches them. They are a display of the judge's wealth and intelligence, but James is the one who is able to make use of them. And he does. This man is having arguments with philosophers in his head. There are scenes of him arguing with Voltaire and John Locke while he has a fever. So Jim and James have always been stuck in this dichotomy, but Jim has always been kind of the default. He's an easy mask to wear. But being out on the Mississippi River with Huckleberry Finn begins to change things. It is harder for James to stay Jim around this boy. And as they spend longer and longer with James away from servitude, having to make his own choices, being a really active character, James really starts to take over in a way that becomes really fucking dangerous for him. And that's probably as much as I'll say in that direction, because there lies story spoilers. But I do really appreciate that the more of the world that James sees for himself and the more atrocities he witnesses, it's like he has so much more reason to just play the part and be Jim and do whatever the fuck he has to do to survive. But he's less and less able to because he's so angry. And anger depicted in black men is an interesting and a political thing because so often it is seen as the default. You know, there is a trope of the angry black man. Black men are seen by justice systems around the world as inherently prone to violence. But Percival Everett builds up and holds off this anger for so long that it feels overdue. It is not innate, it is earned. Having said that, the tone of this book is not, I guess, what you'd expect. The way it's written and James's wit kind of puts it somewhere in the realm of a dark comedy. Nothing that is happening is funny, but it is wall-to-wall absurd. The audacity on display in this book. It did occasionally remind me of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, the movie by the Coen brothers, which I do need to talk about in another video because it is just the best adaptation of the Odyssey. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is more overtly a comedy, but it is very much in that sort of dark political commentary realm, and they are both fantastic examples of road stories. Now, I don't know if road story is the technical term, but by using it, I just mean a story that happens on a journey going from place to place. Think a road trip movie, but without a car. Now, these kinds of stories are incredibly hard to do well. And the reason for it is that it's hard to keep up a sense of what we call narrative traction. Narrative traction is that sense of cause and effect in a story. This is happening because the protagonist did this. This is already something that is hard to pull off in writing anyway, but it's harder to pull off in a road story because your protagonist is already walking in a direction. They have a broad destination in mind, there may be obstacles in the way. This all creates a sort of false sense of movement and action. But when you actually break down those action beats, what you might find is a story that's just going here, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then they go here, and then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. The protagonist is essentially strapped into a cart on one of those Disney rides that's just gonna like show you places. It's just gonna take you around. And that's boring. So you need to have a really strong story, not just plot and character development along that sort of predetermined route. Because unless the obstacles actually mean something to the protagonist, it's just faffing around. All of which is to say that O Brother Where Art Thou and James are both road stories with really strong narrative traction. I thought this book was absolutely incredible. I would like to get a copy for my shelf and to read it again, but I am so pleased that I started with the audiobook. The vocal performance by Dominic Hoffman is so great, and he really illustrates the code switching of the slaves from when they're speaking to each other and when they're speaking to white people. It's one of those audiobook experiences that I think really enhances the story. So yeah, I can't speak to the conversation this book is having with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, but I would really love to hear the thoughts of anyone who has read both and wants to weigh in the comments below. But as a standalone novel, Percival Everett really fucking brought it. This was also nominated for the Booker Prize last year, which makes it the first year I have not only read one of the entries on the shortlist for the Booker Prize, but fucking 3? I don't know who I'm becoming. And James is my favorite of the 3. I did DNF Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, but I really liked Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I do think I can see the Booker Prize panel's reasoning from an ideological standpoint. Orbital looks to the future, whereas James looks to the past. And this does do a good job. It is pensive and thoughtful and political. In a way, it is sort of charging us to get our shit together before it's too late, which I think is a very respectable message in these very scary times. But also what's happening in these scary times is the rise of conservatism and nationalism, both of whom are groups of people who look to the past with a real sense of romantic nostalgia. And the past they're looking to are places like the antebellum South. And I think now is just a great time to become even a casual student of history and to look at it with clear eyes. Which is not to say that I am mad that Orbital won by any stretch. I just like James better. I think I'm a bit sick, which brings me no joy, but I have finished 2 more books. The first one of those is A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez and translated from Spanish by Megan McDowell. This is a collection of contemporary horror stories set in and around Buenos Aires, sort of post-2020. The pandemic is explicitly mentioned in a bunch of these stories, and I am so grateful for that shit. I feel like I am living in a parallel universe sometimes when I read contemporary stories that just have absolutely no mention whatsoever of COVID-19. And I know some people like prefer not to be reminded, they prefer complete escapism, but like it just takes me out of the timeline in which we are currently living. Like, that's not contemporary fiction to me. That's wishful spec fic. Not that you have to mention COVID-19, coronavirus, the pandemic, whatever, like, just for the sake of it, but we're fucking relevant, you know? Anyway, look how spectacular, oh god, there it is. Look how spectacular this cover is. My partner asked me not to leave it on the kitchen island while he was eating. This is the first of Mariana Enriquez's works that I have read. I have been tempted by Our Share of Night before in the shop, but have always been afraid of just how girthy that book is. So I thought that starting with her short stories might be a good plan, and it was. I really enjoyed these. This is a really cohesive collection. Most of the stories in it are ghost stories, and what I have discovered about Mariana Enriquez is that she is fantastic about writing the kind of atmosphere and the in-depth character, like explorations that you would want from a ghost story. I find her character work very, very beautiful. These are all very short stories, but she has created people with rich histories and inner lives for every single one of them. And if you remember my little rant from a couple months ago about Emily Austen's work being completely stripped of its sense of place by her American publishers, this is a great example of the opposite of that. Mariana Enriquez's work is absolutely brimming with a sense of time and place. I have never been to Argentina or Los Angeles, which is the only other location used in this entire collection, but she paints them so vividly, not just physically, but societally and politically. She gives Buenos Aires and Los Angeles and a bunch of the other little sort of remote Argentinian towns featured in here personalities of their own. They're really unique and they're really engaging. And that's just one element of what makes this collection so cohesive. You know, she's using these multiple stories to tell us a larger story about a place in a certain time. The other thing that makes it so cohesive is kind of the themes of the stories being ghost stories. A lot of them are linked by a sense of loneliness and unfulfilled purpose and regret. And she really seamlessly manages to tie that back into the other point, which is that she ties all of those to the sense that Buenos Aires has been abandoned by its political leaders, and the small towns in Argentina even more so. She turns the entire country into something of a ghost and a possession story, and it's really fucking interesting. It's just a really excellent collection. You can tell that Mariana Enriquez is an absolute pro. Most of the stories are left sort of open-ended, so maybe steer clear if you need your short stories to end in an exclamation point rather than a question mark, but this has convinced me that I need to bring home her giant novel the next time I see it, or at least snap up all of her short story collections. Also, short story collections are just fantastic if you are having concentration or focus issues, or even if you're in like just a reading slump. The other book I finished was a reread of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Goodreads says it's my third time reading it. I suspect it's my fourth. I love and appreciate this book more every time I read it. I think Jane Austen was an absolute master at character work and dialogue. Although for me, dialogue always ties back into character work. I think they are inseparable skills. The cast of Pride and Prejudice is so memorable for a reason. Every character is so unique. They have such a strong personal voice. They are also nuanced. There are such clear and satisfying character arcs for our protagonists in particular, but even for a couple of the side characters. It's a vivid portrait of life in when was it, like 1812? Okay, published 1813 and possibly written at the sort of end of the 1700s. Definitely a snapshot of a very specific class in a very specific place, being south of England, Middle England? They're a comfy distance between Derbyshire and London, so they must be in the middle. And yet, despite the incredibly different social situation, every single character is someone you would not be very surprised to meet today. I think it's kind of a remarkable documentation of humanity in that way. But you know, on a fiction level, it is fantastically funny and clever. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are a couple I genuinely love seeing get together. They both have such well-defined and complementary personalities, and the obstacles between them are significant but not insurmountable. Lizzie doesn't like Mr. Darcy through a combination of malicious gossip and the fact that he is a proud motherfucker. The gossip is obviously false, and the pride is something that he actively works on when called out on it. The scene where Lizzie first rejects Mr. Darcy is genuinely spectacular. Like, just from a craft perspective, the dialogue in that scene is fucking magnificent. Actually, every conversation between them is fantastic. The dance between them in Netherfield Ball is one of my favorite examples of a cross-purpose conversation, which is a conversation in which at least one person in the conversation thinks they are having a very different conversation
than the one that the other person is having. And this happens between them a couple times, I think, but the refusal is incredible because finally Lizzie is on the same page as Darcy and she is fucking furious. She is so polite at adhering by the sort of class rules that dictate how she should refuse a man. And he just keeps picking at her until she cuts loose and lets him know every possible flaw of his character. And this has never happened to him before. And he gets mad. Like, this isn't just an example of people sniping at each other for plot purposes because the plot required them to sort of not get together at this point so that they can get together at this point. It's wholly based in character. And it propels us beautifully into the next stage of the story. And that is the other thing I really noticed on this particular read, is that Pride and Prejudice has the most incredible sense of momentum. Everything leads to the next thing and then it is all tied up at the end. It is beautifully done, and yes, this would be an example of narrative traction. Yeah, it is a flawless book, and I find myself turning to the book more often than I do to any of the adaptations these days. And I say that as someone who has watched the BBC miniseries from 1995 literally an uncountable number of times. Controversially, I guess, according to the youth of the internet, I don't care for the 2005 version. I mean, I don't care for the director's work generally, but for his Pride and Prejudice, I think it is absolutely beautiful to look at. I think a lot of the casting is really great, and some of it just doesn't work for me at all, to the point where it kind of just makes it difficult to watch. But the biggest issue for me is that I don't think Pride and Prejudice works in a short form feature film. I need the full 6 hours. It's just too rushed otherwise. Pride and Prejudice takes place over a year, and I feel like I really need to feel that space, which I just don't do in the feature. I don't feel this way about any other Jane Austen adaptation except Emma, because I think Emma is a big book, and I do prefer the miniseries of that to the feature film from, I think, 2020, although I did like it. I'm not as against it as I am 2005 Pride and Prejudice. Maybe I just hate that Pride and Prejudice. I'm not a snob. I really enjoyed that Netflix Persuasion everyone hated. Now, because I have talked about Pride and Prejudice and the Muppets in this vlog, it could be, arguably, a good opportunity to talk about Muppet Pride and Prejudice, which I have been asked about many, many times, and which I've seen people talking about across the internet for years, even more times. It's become something of a meme. I mean, any sort of Muppet adaptation casting idea has become quite a sort of meme format on the internet over the past decade, but Pride and Prejudice seems to be the one that people really hone in on. Emily McGovern actually makes a great argument against Pride and Prejudice as a Muppet adaptation in Muppet Napoleon, and I agree. Pride and Prejudice is all wrong for what makes a good Muppet film. There's way too much talking and inaction. The Muppets are very physical comedy based. There aren't many places to add physical comedy in, aside from one opportunity, I think, to have Miss Piggy throw Kermit out a window. And it's a female focused cast, and there simply are not enough female Muppets. And going back to my earlier point, which actually, no, I do stand by, because Pride and Prejudice does need more room to breathe than Emma does. And a Muppet movie would have to be even shorter than a prestige human drama people film. You can't have a 2+ hour Muppet movie, and you can't have an hour and a half Pride and Prejudice. And Muppet movies have to be musicals, or at least feature elaborate musical numbers. And while I do suddenly desperately want to see a musical number called Netherfield Park is Let at Last, starring a whole bunch of Muppet women, I don't know if there's enough to sustain a full musical, or I don't know if you could distill enough of the scenes down into a musical number. I do think Wickham would have an amazing patter song, though. That said, if I had to cast a Muppet Pride and Prejudice, these would be my choices for the main cast. Lizzie and Darcy, Piggy and Kermit.
this is somehow both obvious and controversial. The people of the internet favor humans in these roles, and I can see it on a sort of thematic basis with Lizzie and Darcy considering themselves the only people in a sea of Muppets, and also the sort of precedent of humans starring in the Muppets classic adaptations rather than the Muppets themselves, which they normally do in their other Muppet films. But I would argue that two good films does not a format make, and Darcy and Lizzie's dynamic is absolutely perfect for Kermit and Piggy's dynamic. It's not an exact match, which is fine because you have to remember that the Muppets in these movies are playing roles. They are serious actors taking on serious parts. But they have great precedent in rom-com roles playing off each other, and I think Lizzie and Darcy is a great exaggeration of certain elements in each of their natures. I have frequently seen them cast as Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet, and I can see where that comes from. Miss Piggy would make an incredible Mrs. Bennet, but there's also no way in hell that she would ever allow anyone else to play the lead in this movie. This would be the role of Miss Piggy's career. She would not give it up to anyone, human or Muppet. But you could get two bites of that cherry and bring in a new Muppet who has been referenced in the past but never seen on screen. Mrs. Piggy should play Mrs. Bennet. She would be Miss Piggy times 1,000. She would be a stone cold hottie, and she would be amazing. And we pair her with a human actor who would have to be Colin Firth. As for the supporting cast, Gonzo, Perfect Bingley, that is a common casting note that I have no problems with. Same with pairing him, obviously, with Camilla as Jane, thereby forcing Miss Piggy to frequently defer to her chicken sister as the hottest one. I don't want to imply that Jane's dialogue isn't important. I think it is, but I think so much of it could be redelivered by Miss Piggy, sort of who speaks chicken but must translate it for the audience. As for the rest of the Bennet sisters, I have a slightly different take on them to any that I've seen online. Janice is frequently cast as Lydia, and I get it because she is one of the few Muppet women anyone can think of the name of, and she is a hottie, but her vibe is all wrong. She's not a party chick. She's really laid back. I mean, well, she is a party chick, but she's a really chill party chick. Janice is Mary. We spin Mary into being more spiritual than religious, but that's it. You slap a pair of glasses on her, and that's Mary. Mary is the least hot Bennet sister, but that does not mean that Mary is not a hottie herself. The Bennet sisters are notoriously gorgeous, so the least hot one should just be wearing glasses. Lydia and Kitty, we bring back the two teenage pigs from A Muppet Christmas Carol, Belinda and I want to say Bettina. It does not matter which one plays which. Mr. Collins is Fozzie Bear. I will not accept a single argument on that front. Again, I'm not saying that Fozzie spiritually is Mr. Collins, just that he exaggerates certain elements in his nature that are already there, and he would play him brilliantly. Charlotte Lucas, I think, should be human, and I think she should be one of the most gorgeous human actors around, like your Zendaya, your Florence Pugh, because I love the idea of Miss Piggy and everyone else referring to her as Miss Piggy's plain friend. And I do enjoy the theory that on some level, Muppets find humans a little bit hideous, even though demonstrably they don't. Miss Piggy will hit on any human hottie around. And then I will completely contradict that theory by making Wickham human as well. So maybe Charlotte should be the hottest because it wouldn't work if they were both hot and only one of them is hot in context. Who else is in this? I don't think I care about the rest of the cast in this context. I think the only other casting I would feel strongly about is that Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I mean, you could cast her as, what's-her-face, Jennifer Ely, as a fun nod back to Pride and Prejudice 95, but I think she should be played by Mrs. Fossey.
Mrs. Fozzie Bear, Fozzie's mum. But yeah, I don't think this movie should ever exist outside of the theoretical. I think the fact that we've never seen anyone follow through with a fan script, as far as I'm aware, is probably a sign that it doesn't work that well on paper. So yeah, that's Muppet Pride and Prejudice. I really just want to see the scene where Lizzie rejects Darcy, as played by Miss Piggy and Kermit, which is played completely straight, word for word, and the only change is that they're on like the second floor of a building, and during this refusal, Piggy just picks him up and throws him out a window, and he just gets himself up and dusts himself off, and it's just like, and this is all the answer I do expect. I can see it so clearly. It's an amazing scene, but it does not deserve to have a whole movie built around it. And that's fine. I genuinely don't think we're getting any more real Muppet classic adaptations again ever. I don't even know if we're ever getting any more Muppet movies. I think the Muppets with Jason Segel was fine. I think the Muppets Most Wanted was actually fantastic. It's one of the best Muppet movies they've done, but they just haven't been successful, nor have any of the attempts at Muppet shows in the last 10, 15 years. And I say this as the one fan of the Muppets sitcom. Even Muppet Babies got cancelled, I think. So while I think Disney is going to keep a tight hold on that license, I think the Muppets from this point on will probably mostly exist in fan creations and nostalgic merchandise. And I'm not sure if I hope that I'm wrong or not. I would love to see more great Muppet stuff. Obviously, I'd love to write more great Muppet stuff, but at the same time, I think it's okay for stuff to end. It's also okay for stuff to change, as the Muppets have over their many decades long run. But yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens. It's also the second last day of January. I don't know if I'm gonna finish anything by tomorrow, but I will check back in and let you know. I did finish another book, and that book has a very long title. What is it? It is Blood in the Machine, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech by Brian Merchant. This is a non-fiction examination of the origins and history of the Luddite movement from the early 1800s to basically now. If you are familiar with the term Luddite, you've possibly heard it said in the pejorative sense. They have been mischaracterized over the years intentionally as technophobic simpletons. You know, if you raise any sort of criticisms, concerns, fears about any form of technology, chances are someone with a vested interest in that technology is gonna call you a Luddite. But the Luddites of history, just like the Luddites of today, are not afraid of technology. They were concerned of the ways that technology would be used to undermine labor and undermine wages, which it did and which it is. So Brian Merchant tells the story of this first big Luddite uprising from about 1811 to 1817, I think is the parameters. And he does this by following a huge cast of real life characters. It's not narrative nonfiction, but the way he breaks it up is really, really engaging. We follow textile workers, child laborers, slaves, poets, authors, the industrialists and their spies within the Luddite movement, princes, inventors, some very famous historical figures of the time pop up. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley were all quite famous Luddite sympathizers. Charlotte Bronte is there. Aaron Burr pops up for a hot second. On the Luddite side of things, it's quite a thrilling and moving story about collective action and community and determination. They are painted as a violent movement, which is in itself an interesting reframing because the violence was almost entirely against machines and property. And that was only after their questions, concerns, policy suggestions were turned away, completely ignored or denied. And on the side of the industrialists is a incredibly frustrating and all too familiar story of profit over people, and supported in this by the government. Brian Merchant does a really great job of drawing a clear line between the industrialists of the early 1800s and the tech giants of today. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and who's the other one? A freaky little Mark Zuckerberg all get read to filth in this book. It's great. I also really appreciate the way that Brian Merchant took this movement and put it into a timeline of automation, industrialization, the rise of capitalism, and really lays out the playbook of the capitalists, which really hasn't changed even though the technology has advanced significantly, and what works in opposition to it. And this is one of the reasons that I'm getting really into historical nonfiction, because I feel like so many people believe, or at least want you to believe, that history is a thing that just happened at one point in isolation, and not a sequence of events that have directly led to where we are now. Like, just knowing history is now becoming a politicized thing, or I guess it always has been. I really, really enjoyed reading this book, even if it kind of gave me a few little panicky moments about the future. Like, nothing I didn't already know, just a few moments of, oh, it really is as bad as it seems and as I think it is. But this book is also full of encouragement and I guess a sort of reserved hope, but also amazing little factoids that I am going to be annoying people with for years to come. Like, did you know that the Luddites often dressed in drag when they went frame breaking, both to keep themselves sort of disguised and to pay tribute to the spinners who lost their jobs to industrialization before they did? Or did you know that a significant amount of Luddites were transported to Australia as punishment for their Ludditing, which is one of the theories as to why Australia has such a strong labour movement, or at least did. This was a fantastically written book that covered its broad topic area really, really well, because it wasn't just following the Luddite movement, it was also looping in the ripple effects of industrialization and spiritual Luddites. For example, the boom in industrialization in the UK led to a boom in the slave trade in the US to meet cotton demands to feed the machines. And Merchant explores several forms of slave resistance as a Luddite movement in and of itself. And it was amazing reading those chapters, having read James earlier in the month. It just hammered home how well researched James was, but also how horrifically realistic James was. Percival Everett did not have to exaggerate a single thing. But yeah, fantastic book, very well worth reading, and incredibly relevant to everything happening right now. And before I even touch on what a fucking month January was, I do want to give a shout out to a lovely book that was published last week that I am about 60% of the way through the arc of. Artifice Access is a short story anthology exploring disability in fantasy worlds. All of the authors in the collection identify as disabled, and I believe most, if not all, are writing about a disability they have experience with. It's really fascinating seeing the ways that they have chosen to incorporate these disabilities into fantasy environments. Most of them are high fantasy, a couple are contemporary, most of them are queer. It's a really refreshing take on the idea of fantasy, particularly on the idea of cozy fantasy, which I believe a bunch of these stories would fall under. My favorite of the stories so far is an incredible and inventive use of a serious gluten allergy. That one is by an author whose name I can't currently remember, but they have a debut novel coming out this year that I suddenly want to read. This is a really cool project that I would love to see people support so that more editions of it can be put out in various genres, and also because, full disclosure, the editor is a friend of mine. But I have excellent taste in people, so that should be an endorsement. Okay, so that was January. January has been an enormous month in terms of world events. And I do feel like that has influenced some of my reading, and I feel like some of my reading has influenced my understanding. Like, going back to the Palestine Laboratory, Israel and Gaza Israel and Hamas agreed to a 6-week temporary ceasefire, which Israel immediately violated to no repercussions, and is essentially using the 6 weeks to step up its operations in the West Bank, where they do not have a ceasefire agreement, and therefore nobody cares even more. Like, again, we're seeing kids sniped, we're seeing civilians slaughtered, and there's just a resounding shrug from the rest of the world. Donald Trump is officially president now, which is horrifying in and of itself, but he's already talked about how he fully supports clearing Palestinians out of Gaza and redeveloping it. And that's just among 5,000 other things he's done in the past 11 days. Going back to Blood in the Machine, Elon Musk and the rest of the tech billionaires were all front and center at Donald Trump's inauguration. Elon Musk is famously kind of his right-hand guy at the moment, which, you know, who is whose right-hand guy right now? Elon Musk was doing Nazi salutes. Literal Nazi salutes. The whole fucking 9-yard Nazi salute. Twice. Publicly, and the mass media, most of which is now owned by said billionaires, said no, he didn't. Meanwhile, he is actively drumming up support for a German far-right Nazi party and pushing for visas that undermine work conditions and wages and workers' rights, as are all of them. I don't really have a rallying cry. I don't have a clever way to tie all of the things I read together with the very scary world events happening right now that are happening as a culmination of things that have been happening for years and decades and centuries. I guess, looking back at how I have handled this month, just via the lens of this vlog, I think there is a lot of value in both engaging in reality and treating yourself to things that bring you enormous amounts of joy, like the Muppets and Jane Austen and reading books with your friends. James and Pride and Prejudice and one of the books I DNF'd are all books that I was reading in tandem with other people. I was chatting with them about these books for weeks on end, and I was sharing cool little facts from Blood in the Machine with people the entire time I was reading it. So I guess I would say that when the world is overwhelming and scary, it's not escapism that is the answer, I think. I think it is being with and talking with other people. If the Luddites have taught us anything, it is that community is the answer. Also, really fucking big hammers and drag. Stay safe out there, friends. I was about to say that I have to end this video and go to bed because it's really late, and then I looked at the clock. It's 9 p.m. I'm 37. That's so late.